Can never tell when these videos go live. All right, cool. I believe that's live. Welcome to my first attempt at a live stream where we discuss mental health issues from the perspective of those who struggle with them. I got this idea, and I know my equipment is not very good. I know I don't have the highest, quality stream or anything like that. I don't even have a really good non-echoey place which to stream from, but hopefully that's something I can work on along. I got the idea to do something like this. A few months ago, we bought a new house, and the struggle within the world of real estate and the complexities of navigating the stresses of something that is obviously very stressful really put me into one of those typical depressive episodes. Now, I struggle, and I've noticed I'm saying a lot of words, over and over and over again, but I struggle with severe depression, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, though not the nice kind, which my wife has pointed out to me before. There are some people, we sometimes joke that there might be some nice things about, obsessively cleaning, but, let's not make light of things like that. I also have a generalized anxiety disorder. So buying a new house triggered all sorts of stuff. And it's been a rough ride. Now, as I've been going through this recent depressive episode, I kind of realized that the one time that I felt in control of myself, felt, in possession of my faculties, felt sober, although thank goodness alcoholism isn't a problem I struggle with right now, but just feeling like in myself was when I was teaching my classes. And teaching, narrating through a process, discussing things and trying to help guide people's understanding of them is something that really seems quite therapeutic for me. So I've been brainstorming this live stream, and my goal for this, and I call it performative mental health, because oftentimes when I'm depressed and, going through one of those major episodes, my first instinct is to run away from the world. I can't do that. And in actuality, when I force myself to take control of it and I force myself to confront it and discuss it, that seems to be the thing that ultimately leads me to a more stable and healthy place. So even if this video series, never really goes anywhere, just discussing and asking questions and exploring these things is enough to give me a great deal of relief. Now, ultimately, what I would love to do would be to have other people's stories, because I want to talk a lot about, coping mechanisms. I want to answer questions about, mental health issues. Those are the types of goals that I have with this. And, along, I'd very much like to try to do everything I can to build up this conversation and do some real honest to God advocacy work. Now, luckily for me today, I have an excellent question that came in on my Facebook account from an old buddy of mine, Frank Parker-Insco. And his question was this: when it comes to spouses and married couples, when do you know that intervention is needed? Now, that question is extremely sensitive. And one of the things I want to go over here at the very beginning, I'm obviously not a mental health professional. So any advice that I give should very much be taken with a grain of salt. And I think you'll understand why as soon as I answer that question. But, if these types of things are, bubbling up, obviously talk to a therapist. But I've actually spent a couple of days thinking about this question and trying to find an answer to it that would be reliable, that would be something that you could have like a general, path to follow. But the only thing I can come up with is this, and I've got several different layers to discuss. If you have a spouse who suffers from complexities in mental health. One of the things I want to do is I don't want to always talk about things in terms of mental illness, and it's not necessarily like a political correctness thing. It's more like, our language matters. The way we talk about mental health, affects our attitude towards it. And if we constantly think about it in terms of illness, then that's the image that we have of people who struggle with these things. I'm very much in possession of my faculties right now. I don't feel ill, right? I feel like I have a lot of complex issues, but I don't feel ill. So if there's somebody in your life, whether it be a spouse or a family member, who struggles with these types of things, the very first piece of advice I would give you is to probably find a therapist yourself. Now, why would I recommend that? It's not because there's anything wrong with you. And one of the things that I bet they would like to dispel in the mental health field would be to say that only people who have problems or have issues within mental health, they're not the only ones who need to be seeing therapists. In fact, having someone in your life that struggles with these types of things actually causes a lot of stress and puts a lot of demands on the people that they're involved with. Like, you have to function in a capacity that is above and beyond the typical relationship. So like one of the things that, I've talked about with my therapist about lately is, my wife can't be my therapist. I have a therapist. I don't want her to be my therapist. I want us to have I want us to be equal. So having a therapist can answer that question for you, right? And it can also when you've got those types of issues in your life, there are obviously bits of wear and tear on your emotional well-being that will float up just because you've got somebody who's struggling so much and you don't know how to help them, right? You don't have training to do that. So really, in this case, a therapist can also help clarify whether what you're seeing in a person's behavior merits types of intervention, right? There's a lot of really weird stuff I do as someone who struggles with major depression that is abnormal. And that, again, I'm going to go there, and this is probably one of those things that might get this video flagged, but, I'm trying to have an honest conversation here. When it comes to suicidal ideation is very different for someone who has a depressive issue, because suicidal thoughts can kind of sort of be a bit more of like a compulsion. You can think about them a lot, but they're not necessarily something that you're tempted to act on, right? So if I'm thinking about suicide or I'm thinking about death a great deal, that's not necessarily a cause for concern, right? Now, what you do need to look for, and again, I'm very much stepping on the toes of a mental health professional. I don't want to go too far with this, but actual actions that where a sufferer is putting those ideas into action. Things like giving away personal possessions, things like having a plan, things like talking about a particular method that they would, commit suicide. Those are quite concerning. And so I don't want to get too far into that, but here's the point. A therapist is trained to know which behaviors are concerning and which aren't necessarily as concerning. So as far as interventions go, if you're thinking about any type of intervention, whether it's hospitalization or whether you want to have a sit down talk with this person where you're encouraging them to go get help, I would say that it's probably a really good idea to take that professional help step for yourself so that you're coming into it with a little bit more guidance and education. Now, and it's funny too, because when they posed this question and they talked about interventions, intervention is a very large term, right? There's a lot of different types of intervention when it comes not just to mental health, but physical health as well. Now, I'm going to actually throw a lot of credit to the podcast Pod Therapy. It's a rated R podcast where they talk a lot about, from a therapist perspective, and I love them to death. Listening to them is actually kind of therapeutic for me myself, because just listening to therapists speak actually is something that's kind of a weird coping mechanism for me. It puts me in the weird therapy mindset, right? Now, One of the things that they discussed in one of their most recent episodes was about mental hospitalization. This is something that there's a lot of misconceptions about when we talk about intervention. You go to a mental hospital when things are extremely bad, right? You can kind of think of it in terms of, when do you go to an actual hospital, like a physical health hospital? When do you go there? You go there when your ability to live your life is severely impeded, or you're in some type of imminent danger, right? So what is imminent danger for someone who is struggling with mental health issues? Almost 100% of the time, it has to do with suicidality, right? So if they're in a place where you think that, oh God, they are really thinking about taking an action into their own hands, that's when that conversation starts to go to hospitalization. But it can also include things like, there's a lot of instances of people who struggle with major depression. And I'm thinking, I'm going to try my best to really pepper these discussions with books that I've read and authors that I've read, because I want to guide people to where to get more resources about this thing. Andrew Solomon wrote a book called The Noonday Demon, and he discusses from his own perspective and perspectives of people that he's interviewed, people who haven't been able to get out of bed for weeks, people who are no longer able to wash themselves, people who can't feed themselves correctly, people who are really suffering. In those situations, hospitalization may be merited, right? So you just with this one question, this is something that, I try really hard to discuss and talk about my hospitalization, because so many people view this with a great deal of stigma. Going to a mental hospital is something that kind of seems to follow a lot of people around, right? I like to share this story too. When my father was still alive, I was hospitalized, and he told me, he said, "Son, you go in there, you're never coming out again. Your life will be ruined, right? Your whole life will be essentially they're never going to let you go." I like to bring this up because I'm not dissing my dad here, but thank God he was wrong, right? I'm not still in there. I'm out. I'm here wearing my rad Ghostbuster shirt from Roosevelt's. I have my buddy, come here. Okay, he's not cooperating, but that's okay. I have my lovely dog. I have my lovely family. I have a job. I actually work within the community. Hospitalization is not something that will necessarily ruin your life. In fact, I try to iterate this point, and I try to tell people, I don't think I was living a very good life until I was hospitalized. Hospitalization is what helped me get the knowledge necessary to start living a good life, to actually start putting myself back together. So returning to the original question, when it comes to matters of intervention, if you got somebody in your life who's struggling with these types of things, it's a really good idea to get a therapist yourself, because you're navigating extremely, extremely tough waters. And again, I'm going to speak from my own personal perspective here. Depression is something that poisons relationships. And, I don't want to come on here and talk about my own relationships or my marriage very much, although I probably will. When I'm going through a depressive episode, I really, really like diet soda. When I'm going through a depressive episode, it's kind of like wearing really ugly colored glasses, right? Think of rose-colored glasses, but instead it's like a nice pea color. And you've got those on. A depressive episode basically makes every statement to you seem like an insult, seem like a dig, or brings about feelings of shame. Everything. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's intended or not. And that's what's so frustrating and what's so destructive about depression. There can be absolutely no negative intention to a comment or an interaction, and it's going to absolutely drag that conversation or that point down in the mud. And it's really hard for someone stuck in an episode like that to see it as anything other than something extremely negative. Like I said, I want to avoid harping on this type of stuff too much, but I'm really lucky that I've got somebody in my life who's as patient and willing to learn and adapt to my depression the way that she has. Like, my wife is absolutely wonderful about this. And I don't say it enough, but she actually is she doesn't coddle, right? a lot of times one of our first instincts is to coddle someone who has depression. And oftentimes she actually gets quite stern in the face of it. And that is extremely helpful, right? Because she only wants to look at things as they are, not as my delusion is trying to frame them. And man, that's difficult to tell the difference. And so I guess to kind of like wrap up this first episode, which has been very extemporaneous, therapist, you're going to need somebody to help you steer the boat through something like this. You're going to need some type of grounding in the actions that you take, because once mental health goes off the tracks, you're fighting with somebody's very like not functioning brain, and everything becomes a kind of weird mirror of itself. So yeah, like more often than not, the advice I give, and I'm going to try very hard not to just give advice all the time, but rather share perspectives. The advice I'll give is probably going to be point you straight to a therapist. And, you know, navigating this stuff on your own is terrifying. And I don't want anybody to think that they have to be alone in this type of relationship. You're there with the person, and you're there with someone who is facilitating and helping interpret and decode those interactions. And, you know, even if they're just there as like a reference that you just go talk to and help kind of sort of decompress I don't know, man, like that schedule would kind of work for you. It could be something like every 3 or 4 months just to talk about the interactions with the spouse. But like I said, a spouse's depression can very quickly do emotional damage to the spouse who otherwise would not be dealing with depressive symptoms. It is poisonous if you're not careful. So in any case, let me end this stream with this. I'm very interested in questions regarding the experience of mental health, specific mental issues, whether it's ADHD, any of the ones that I've been diagnosed with. But I'm also really interested to know what questions people have about other mental illnesses, because I would really like to try to find people, not therapists, but people who struggle with these issues, to give us answers, whether to actually interview them in this show format or to deliver their feedback myself. Again, this is not just a venture that I'm doing because it's not necessarily like an ego project. I can already see my wife. That makes me happy. It's not just an ego project. This is therapeutic for me. So this project is something that would be a great outlet for me to begin with as well. Now, I'm going to do the self-promotion thing for a minute. Mainly this. I'm going to leave my PayPal address, mainly because I would very much like to put effort into getting better equipment, to getting a good microphone, maybe a good headset, better computer, get some editing stuff in here. Maybe wouldn't it be great if I could get a studio somehow? That would be awesome, right? So those types of things, that's one of the things that I would be asking donations for. Obviously, I'm not going to hunt you down if you don't. I'm not crazy, right? But if this is the type of project that you find interesting or helpful in any capacity, please consider. Because I think that the main goal here is to help people understand one another, and for us to have a little bit more of a common understanding of what it's like, right? There's so many instances that I've encountered through the years where someone has had a question, someone has said something incredibly insensitive, and they don't know, right? I know I've tried to end this stream like 5 times, but I'm going to tell you another real quick story. Somebody else asked me when I was searching for questions for this. Somebody asked what was the most thoughtless or kind of cruel interaction that I'd ever had. I try really hard not to ruminate on things like that, but depression definitely turns you into a cow chewing cud, right? You ruminate, you bring things up and you obsess over it. And there was one comment that I got a long time ago, and it's only fairly recently that I've started to realize that this shouldn't upset me the way that it did. A coworker asked me, why can't you just be happy? And I was like, you fixed it, right? It doesn't work like that. It's funny too, because I think this is a problem that's especially, an issue with depression. When you think about obsessive compulsive disorder, and you think about the fact that people are driven to rituals and have those compulsions that they have, those compulsions are extremely real. To not wash my hands a certain amount a day, right? Or to not check under my car to make sure I haven't run over someone. Or to not go back home 15 times to make sure I didn't leave the oven running. These are examples of some really debilitating compulsions. I don't think people would generally see stuff like that and they'd be like, why don't you just not? Right? There's an understanding that the mind is behaving in a way that does not obey the person who is controlling it, right? The mind is driving us to behaviors. With the case of depression, the mind is being driven to think in a way that is extremely difficult to stop. And that's an obsessive negativity that is just constantly pumping through, right? So there are mind structures that we've built, ways of thinking that we instinctively go to, whether it's for something physical, like how to build with blocks or how to drive a car is probably a better example. Like, you don't have to think very hard about how to drive a car, right? To drive a car in an unnatural way would be just really, really difficult. That's kind of what my brain is doing when it thinks in negative ways. It does what it does, and I can't stop it. I need medication. I need guidance. I need therapy, right? This is not something that I can just sort of change about myself. That's not how it works. Now, with a lot of effort and a lot of therapy, it has gotten better, right? I've only been hospitalized once, which is actually really, really good. Depression especially has a tendency to hospitalize you over and over and over again. There are people who are just in and out of the hospital because they just can't seem to control it, right? Now, the person who asked that question, there's nothing wrong with that question, right? She's coming at this from the perspective of, I don't understand. In that moment, she was trying to understand. She was reaching out and saying, this does not make sense to me. Why can't it be simple? Now, years and years ago, I didn't have an answer. I was so unbelievably lost in this that I was just like, I got mad about it, right? And remember, depression poisons everything. So now, a little older, a little wiser, I look back on it, it doesn't upset me as bad. I'm like, yeah, I mean, honestly, it was kind of a good thing that she asked, right? She was honestly trying to breach the wall that divides us and come to where I was. And I probably didn't help very much in that instance. So when it comes to, the matter of what the cruel comment was, and I wouldn't say it was cruel, and maybe it was ever so slightly thoughtless, but ultimately, I'm glad the question was asked, right? That was an attempt, and there's something to be said about that. So in any case, I'm really hungry, and I'm craving leftover pizza. If you have a question, if you have something that you would like to explore on this show, you can follow me on Twitter at dbfuturist42. I try to frequent the mental health hashtag, and I've also created a performative hashtag. It's just hashtag performative, right? So that could be a place where if you want to ask a question, you can. I would highly recommend Pod Therapy. That podcast is great. Definitely not for kids. It gets, a little intense. In any case, thank you guys very much. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you've gotten some insight today. I really want Buddy to say goodbye, but he is not getting off the chair.